Hi, everyone. Thank you for logging on with us today. We're just going to wait another moment for a few more folks to sign on. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the TBR Webinar series. Today, Practice Manager Allan Krans, Senior Analyst Meaghan McGrath, and Research Analyst McElwee and Catie Merrill will be discussing year in review, shifting from a monocloud to a multi-cloud and a hybrid cloud landscape. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of buttons from left to right. You can access slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, and our survey. After the webinar, you'll receive an email with a replay link, as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions for us, please submit them in the Q&A widget in On24. You may also reach out to us after the event at webinars@tbri.com. Thank you again for joining us, and here's Allan to begin the webinar.
Great, thanks Sarah, and thanks everybody for joining. So as we get started today, just want to take a moment to highlight some of the research that the slides and the discussion will come from as we go through today. So we just recently, within the last month, wrapped up our latest version of the customer studies, which focus on cloud adopters in both the applications as well as infrastructure and platforms spaces. So a lot of the market trends and customer behavior analysis you'll see will be based on that feedback, as well as some of the older versions of that study as we've kind of tracked how the market has changed. And then we're adding in views from the vendor side of our research on the left-hand side of this chart, from the public cloud benchmark, looking at some of the comparisons for infrastructure as a service, revenue share, as well as the individual vendor insights in the AWS, IBM, SAP, and Salesforce reports, as we look at kind of more specifically for how the vendors have reacted in 2019. And so from an overall perspective, really kind of the overarching shift that we saw that to set up this discussion, which does kind of look backwards at 2019 and what were the major things that we saw playing out in terms of the cloud market. So within this shift from a monocloud or a kind of a singular cloud type view going into the year, really kind of validating the premise that for the majority of customers, there's going to be multiple clouds within single workloads operating within that overall environment, as well as the integration between clouds and things that are going to continue to remain on-premise with the hybrid portions of the landscape. And so we'll cover in the infrastructure market. It's pretty interesting because this is actually creating a renewed competition, mainly for the Tier 2 in the infrastructure space in terms of the vendor rankings, but certainly even AWS is feeling some more of the competitive spirit as vendors are seeing adoption pockets within customers within certain use cases, verticals. It's really becoming more clear some of the competitive weaknesses for market leaders, and we'll cover how some of the other players are stepping in to fill those holes. Secondly, in the application space, it's shifted from kind of a productivity and CRM type market for cloud solutions to really encompass a lot more of the enterprise-grade applications for customers. And as those use cases have been proven out, again, we think it's already had a major impact as 2019 has progressed, and customers have gotten more aggressive in terms of what's shifting to a cloud environment and what types of delivery methods are being utilized to support that. And so we'll cover what happened in 2019, as well as a little bit for what we think that means going forward in the application space. And then lastly, we'll cover some of the leading vendors that have really kind of capitalized on some of this opportunity, as well as in reality have created a lot of it through their own investments in go-to-market strategies and portfolio enhancements. So we'll cover AWS, Salesforce, Microsoft, and IBM in that section to kind of go through specifically what they've done and what we think it means for the overall market. So to kind of kick things off, we have a view into the infrastructure space. And so as I said, coming into the year, there were still a lot of questions around how many cloud platforms for infrastructure and platforms customers were going to put in place, who those standards would be. And so I think we uncovered a couple things in 2019 through our customer research. The first is that whether, so there's a lot of trade-offs and benefits for having multiple cloud platforms and what's required to do that. So there's a trade-off customers are still going through. So some of the things that are inhibitors to that are, having the skills and training to be proficient on more than one platform. These things are changing all the time with new features and services being deployed. So it really is an investment to establish and maintain that level of skill to operate multiple different platforms. Some of the benefits are obviously having some long-term flexibility in terms of being able to migrate workloads from one service to another should economic or strategic decisions change within organizations. We still see a desire to be able to do that. Some of the things that customers are, kind of giving up by investing in a single platform are those negotiating tactics to be able to have a viable second option that, really could be an alternative to consolidating with a certain provider. So those are all some of the trade-offs and benefits that customers at least logically go through in terms of making this decision. Towards the end of the year, though, we really heard from a number of customers that regardless of those cost-benefit trade-offs, in a lot of ways the multi-cloud is a reality that's being forced upon them. Whether it's acquiring for growth, which happens in a lot of industries and is a common business strategy, you're going to be bringing in acquired targets that have different platforms that aren't going to be easy to migrate or move, and so it's going to need to be integrated into the current environment rather than shifted over. So acquisitions was a big one that came up for customers. And then also, again, getting to some of the enterprise workloads, as you kind of widen the net to include partners and peers and distributors in terms of the overall, supply chain functions or go-to-market functions, the need to be able to share information back and forth, a lot of times that's based on different cloud and IT environments, is a requirement to adopt some of these new business practices and take advantage of data from multiple different sources. And so to be able to operate in that type of business environment, multi-cloud is really kind of a forced reality for a lot of customers. And so we do think that's going to be the direction through the end of this year and into next in terms of how customers are looking to adopt at the infrastructure and platform layer. So to kind of deal with some of that, containers has really stepped in to become the standard, and in Kubernetes management, the standard for being able to work in a multi-cloud environment, to have portability and flexibility in terms of how things are managed, and then also to adopt DevOps and DevSecOps and all those operational changes that we see customers really looking to deliver multiple elements of benefit for them. Kubernetes is really at the core, and so that's kind of the solution to dealing with some of this multi-cloud complexity. So in terms of how customers are going to go forward, what we see in this quote gets at some of it, that most customers are going to look to have one primary cloud platform that they standardize, put a significant portion of their investment on, but also have second and third cloud platforms that are either part of that acquisition strategy or as we call out here, deliver some cloud-native benefits that are inherent in the solution that are unique. And so we see Azure and even Google Cloud Platform being looked to for certain types of workloads based on unique features and functionality that are inherent to that platform. So, going forward, that's kind of the landscape that we expect to see, one primary, but certainly opportunity to compete for that second and third cloud, which is a lot of the competitive aspect that we see within the infrastructure and platform space. So here's kind of a statistical view from our studies that shows the platform and infrastructure workloads are on the bottom of the graph in the upper left-hand corner, that for a significant portion of customers, they're still looking to add vendors to their environments in these different workloads. Applications kind of leads that overall consideration, but it's notable that 10 years into the overall kind of AWS starting this space, there's still, I think, a renewed vendor consideration actually for unique attributes and some of those situations that come up as customers are looking at it on a workload by workload basis. So from the overall vendor landscape on the bottom right, we have some of our projections for public cloud revenue in this space. So AWS really continues to be the leader. We'll cover some of the things that are working against them, continuing to consolidate the market in the later sections. And then Azure becomes the clear number two. And that's come up a number of times where Azure, through the Microsoft customer base as well as within certain verticals, is capitalizing on the investments and the leading position in that second tier that they've really established. One element that's got a little bit of a curveball is around the decision making, and so we call it out in some of the text on the slide, but especially in the platform space, which is where a lot of tier 2 providers are looking to differentiate and compete rather than trying to do it just on the infrastructure itself, that a lot of the decision making is shifted from the leadership within development and IT functions down into the developers themselves. And this ties into an overall theme of 2019 of scarcity of skills in a lot of ways, and the impact on decision making is that a lot of the leadership doesn't want to, can't afford to lose talent and developers in this type of environment, so the tool sets that make them most comfortable and productive are the ones that are winning out. And so for a lot of vendors that have established relationships at higher levels of some of these customer organizations, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to leverage that in the same way that they have historically to keep those customers and to expand deals. So decision making, especially in the platform space, is something that we see changing and benefiting, those that kind of focus on innovation and the productivity of developers. And then to kind of close out the infrastructure and platform view, here we have, some of the consideration for the types of cloud delivery methods. And this relates to some of the applications discussion that we'll go through, but as more mission-critical workloads are being moved to cloud and will continue to move going forward, consideration for delivery methods that kind of reside in the middle ground of this spectrum that goes from traditional on-premise IT right through public cloud are really started to increase in 2019. And we think that'll be accelerated by the types of workloads that are being moved through, kind of beginning next year and really accelerating. Hosted private cloud in particular, so the bare metal instances and the cloud service provider networks that are doing dedicated infrastructure solutions for customers have really kind of grown in consideration and awareness as the workloads have changed and are kind of filling in that middle ground. Again, it goes back partially to skills where being able to consume not just the technical solution, but the managed services and consulting that really help customers round out the overall implementation for a lot of those workloads is important. And for the public cloud solutions, it's more difficult for customers to make that connection and certainly to get the hands-on type service that they can get from some of the smaller cloud service provider partners that are out there. And so diversity of consideration for cloud delivery methods is another thing we think we saw in 2019 and that we believe will continue going forward. Okay, so that covers the infrastructure and platform side. We'll shift over to the enterprise application space and take a look at how more mission-critical workloads are being considered, and we saw starting to be adopted, and we think will accelerate as we go into next year.
All right. Yeah, so on the applications front, we've seen a lot of evolution, particularly sort of in the cloud space. And so I'm first going to go through some of the customer study takeaways that are clearly SaaS focused, and then kind of dive into some vendor context as well. So I think looking at sort of what overall themes we've seen emerge throughout 2019 in the customer studies, we've really seen SaaS adoption has grown past what we kind of considered the initial workload adoption, which was very heavily weighted towards sort of productivity and front office workloads. And not only have customers really kind of leaned into those more mission-critical workloads, but how SaaS is sort of being considered as part of corporate planning has really evolved as well. We've seen SaaS adoption become really a key and interrelated piece of corporate planning. So enterprises are really more actively incorporating IT planning into their corporate strategic planning and initiatives. And so that does include sort of how customers are using infrastructure and platform services, kind of moving from a more lift and shift consideration to cloud-native development, but also on the applications front, moving sort of those critical core systems to cloud. The other kind of development in that space is that customers are becoming much more deliberate in how they're looking at the opportunity to move certain workloads to cloud with the opportunity to keep those workloads on-premise and maybe just modernize them, be that augment them with a newer solution or replace them with a more modern solution as well. And so customers are becoming much more deliberate in these considerations, and we're really seeing this theme of cloud first but hybrid IT aware emerge. And so that's customers who have
really kind of establish this cloud-first mentality. So the ultimate goal of moving to cloud solutions or cloud resources, it has not gone away, but also the reality that there are workloads that are going to stay on-premise, kind of becoming a realization that workloads are going to start spanning these environments, and there's really going to need to be an integration across sort of on-premise environments and cloud environments. And so customers are still sort of evaluating workloads and data sets individually and balancing the benefits of cloud adoption versus on-premise deployment, but also kind of layering that with this idea of hybrid IT aware. So really an integration across different environments. The other thing we're seeing customers really try to kind of shift their internal mentality on is how they're looking at different workloads with the lens of whether they adopt a horizontal solution from a vendor and how much they customize solutions. And so we've seen a lot of customers over the last year really kind of take a step back and try to, in particular, from sort of the C-suite, we've talked to a couple CTOs and CIOs who have been very clear in their approach to being sort of one where you step back and you take a look at how critical is this workload, how critical is this application to our differentiation as a vendor. With the, I'll say, maturation of vendor products sort of in the SaaS arena, customers have the opportunity to kind of take that, dive in to a solution that may get them 80 or 90% of the way there, and then really be controlled in how much they customize that solution, how much they deviate from sort of the out-of-the-box solution, so that they can divert their innovation dollars to the more critical differentiating processes within their kind of workflow. And so I'll dive into that a little bit more on the next slide, but I think the other point to bring up that we've seen kind of emerge over this last year is, and this is something that's kind of a holdover from the last couple of years, but it's becoming much more clear, is customers' acceptance of sort of this multi-vendor SaaS environment. So where customers may have gotten past their initial workload adoption and they're kind of looking at the vendor landscape and they're evaluating now what is the reality between stitching together a best-of-breed environment versus going with these more robust application suites that vendors have built over the last couple of years in particular. We're definitely still seeing customers committing to this idea of a multi-vendor SaaS environment. So even where vendors like Oracle are promoting their entire Fusion suite as sort of a one-stop shop, customers are still very much leaning into this idea of, as they evaluate new workloads to move to cloud, they are still evaluating new vendor environments. And I think that that's really a function of some of the integration platforms and some of the platform investments from vendors. And it's also driven some of that investment by vendors. I think sort of you can look at the MuleSoft acquisition by Salesforce as you can say it's a proactive move or a reactive move, as being sort of proactive to help Salesforce coexist as customers look at these more multi-vendor and realities, or reactive as they sort of see that coming down the pipeline and trying to make sure that they can remain a leading vendor as customers adopt solutions from other vendors. So a lot of sort of moving pieces in that end of the market. The other piece of this slide that I haven't touched on really is the line of business versus IT sort of dynamic. I'll dive into that a little bit more on the next slide, so I'm just going to kind of move right through. So I think this slide is an interesting one, and I think we wanted to put it in here mostly just because it's a good look at sort of how customers are changing their investment strategies. The graph on the left, you can see sort of the dark red color being the 2H18 survey that we did and the orange being the 1H19 survey that we did, you can kind of see this change in customer perception even though it's really only 6 months apart. We're kind of seeing in 2019 this shift from the two extremes of customers deciding they're either going to keep most of their workloads running in their own data center or most of their workloads running in a vendor-owned environment, and kind of customers are merging towards this middle ground of having what they're calling a roughly even mix of running workloads in-house and in vendor-owned cloud environments. So I think that in and of itself is really just a good kind of summary of how customer perception is changing in terms of how they're going to balance this cloud first but hybrid IT aware kind of reality that they're moving into. The other graph on the right-hand side it gives you an indication of what customers look at how they're looking at their investments now, and then how they expect those investments to kind of look 3 years from now. And I think it's pretty interesting when you kind of consider what customers are responding to this question. I kind of look at it as in the now, customers have really pushed resources away from maintaining existing systems, and they're either kind of balancing the maintenance of existing systems with innovation, or they're pushing their sort of IT investments towards innovation. But in 3 years from now, customers actually expect their IT investments to kind of shift back towards maintaining those existing systems, albeit there's still going to be a lot of investment in innovation. But to me, that says that customers between now and sort of the 2022, 2023 era are really going to be doing a lot of, rather than just maintenance of their existing systems, they're going to be doing either a lot of modernization or replacement of their existing systems. And so I think the kind of one of the undertones of the data on the right-hand side is that the now is really where there's a lot of opportunity for maybe cloud-native vendors to win new customers from the sort of legacy applications stronghold of customers, but also for customers who have, for vendors who have legacy customers to really help those customers move over the next couple of years, because customers are expecting that those investments are going to be made in the next 2 or 3 years, and come sort of 2023, they're going to kind of move back into this situation of maintaining the systems that they have invested in. So I think that it's just sort of an interesting trend that we'll definitely keep a pulse on in terms of how customers are investing their dollars. And I think that's another kind of piece of the story that we didn't put into the slides here today, but that are kind of showing in some of the survey data that we're seeing. I think as you'd expect, we're kind of seeing that customers, when asked about what's going to stay in their own data centers as sort of what they're most hesitant to move to cloud, as you'd expect, HR and ERP stay near the top of the list. But then when you kind of look at what workloads are definitely going to be hosted in a public cloud or private cloud over the next 3 years, HR applications other than productivity still kind of top that list too. So there's going to be a lot of, I think, nuanced conversations about which workloads are moving. So it's going to depend highly on sort of the customer's legacy environment, their expectations for maybe acquisitions in the future, their concerns about privacy, risk, talent. Allan brought up a lot of these points earlier on, but just the fact that sort of HR tops both the list of staying on-premise or staying in the customer's own data center, but also still yet to move to and expected to move to cloud in the next 3 years, that in and of itself indicates there's going to be a lot of sort of nuanced conversation about which customers are on which end of those spectrums. So with that, I'll move into the vendor section of this, webinar, I think we're going to go through a couple of just sort of the kind of key vendors in the space, both in the platform and infrastructure space, but also the application space. That's not to say these are the only interesting developments of 2019, but we think they're kind of the noteworthy vendors to recap what's gone on in 2019 within these vendors and what that means for the landscape as a whole. So moving first into sort of the AWS and Microsoft Azure dynamic, you'll see in the rest of these slides that each vendor has their own slide. But as I've sort of had these conversations with clients over the last few months about kind of what's been going on this year and what does that mean for next year, I found that if I was presenting AWS before Azure, or Azure before AWS, I'd kind of erode the storyline of one by talking about the other. And so we thought it best to sort of bring these two vendors together and talk about the dynamic that's going on between them. And so I think what's really become evident in 2019, this has been a big year in terms of vendors challenging AWS, and that's not to say that AWS didn't have any challenges before 2019, but in 2019 we're seeing them really bear fruit in terms of the financials, which are kind of depicted in the graphs at the bottom, and I'll touch on in a minute or two. But we're really seeing the actions of the competitive landscape, sort of the non-AWS landscape, impact AWS. Maybe not incredibly significantly. I don't think they're worried in any greater sense, but there's definitely some traction to note. So, I mean, and Allan talked about this a little bit earlier on, that customers are definitely favoring different vendors for different workloads, and that's lending to more of this hybrid multi-cloud landscape, which I think is really kind of a key summary of how this is favoring the non-AWS vendors. So clearly, AWS had an early footprint in accounts and in the platform and infrastructure market, but that is less often precluding other vendors from winning sort of that next workload under consideration. And so we've seen this really benefit Microsoft over the last year in particular. Microsoft being a key vendor or destination for IoT workloads is it's really no surprise, but I think that continues to come up as one of the key workloads that Microsoft is winning over AWS, and they're really building out their portfolio of tools in that space and continuing to sort of enable IoT use cases through different Azure Stack innovations, edge compute innovations, and things like that. But that has kind of been an ongoing trend that I would say surrounds 2019 rather than defines it. What we really see kind of define 2019, particularly for Azure and for how Azure is competing against AWS, is the partnership activity. And so those partnerships that have happened, sort of especially on the Azure front, have really been central to our conversations about what has changed in 2019. So I think the first couple of notable partnerships are definitely sort of the Oracle partnership, where Microsoft and Oracle have established sort of the direct connect between their services within a couple of data centers. I believe it's available not only in Virginia but in London now. But there's definitely plans to roll that out more globally moving into 2020 as Oracle builds out its data center footprint pretty rapidly. And that is not something that we've seen a ton of customers point to as sort of a decision-making factor yet, but it's definitely something customers are interested in terms of being able to use Oracle databases while still using sort of the broader and I would say more mature platform portfolio of Microsoft, particularly IoT services. The other partnership that is notable, not as groundbreaking, I don't think, is the VMware partnership between Microsoft and VMware. A lot of vendors at this point have partnered with VMware in the same sense that VMware had originally partnered with AWS. I know IBM was pretty close following the AWS announcement, but now Microsoft and Google have also jumped on that train. And so this idea that AWS was very early to partner with VMware and to enable VMware-based workloads to come to their cloud services. The field of vendors has really kind of broken that down, that advantage or differentiator. So while AWS may still have the most reference customers in that area, most other vendors at this point can also offer customers a VMware on their cloud services offering. And so that's kind of, again, eroded some of AWS's differentiation in the space. The other partnership that has definitely been headline-grabbing is the SAP partnership. Full disclosure, the next slide is on SAP, so I'm going to kind of balance the conversation between this slide and the next one. But Microsoft in particular, in October, was named SAP's preferred public cloud partner as part of sort of SAP's go-to-market, particularly for the S4 portfolio, but also in general. And so the SAP side of that being that SAP is remaining very vendor agnostic. They're continuing to offer customers choice in which hyperscale cloud environment the customer wants to deploy their SAP solutions on. But the alliance between Microsoft and SAP is still, or the deepening of the alliance between Microsoft and SAP, that's still pretty notable in the sense that Microsoft is now bringing the SAP Cloud Platform solutions through their Salesforce to customers. And so there's a much closer alignment of the SAP and Microsoft go-to-market efforts, although kind of as I mentioned, SAP continues to caveat that with their vendor agnosticism. There's no denying the alignment between those two vendors. And so that will definitely bear fruit for both SAP and Microsoft. I think Microsoft is really a big benefactor because going back to some of the customer discussions we've had in the customer studies, AWS had, up until, I would say, probably June or July when we were talking to customers, AWS still had a big lead in those considerations where customers were kind of looking at how they were going to adopt SAP S/4HANA. Customers were very much kind of looking at the AWS versus Azure consideration. And AWS, a couple of times, was noted as the vendor that had by far the most reference customers. And so some customers were going to Azure because they were Azure shops. Some were kind of leaning that direction for incentive reasons or financial reasons. But overall, Microsoft really lagged AWS in terms of reference customers and mind share in sort of the S/4HANA migration discussion. So the then deepening of their alliance in October, I think we're going to see that really bear fruit for Microsoft in particular. So moving down to what this means in terms of the financial outputs we've seen at the bottom. So on the right-hand side, I'll start over there, the darker bar is the sequential change in AWS revenue on a quarterly basis, and the lighter bar is the Azure sequential change in revenue. And although the Azure revenue is estimated based on growth rates, what you see in this last quarter in 3Q19 is this sudden inflection where the Microsoft Azure change in revenue is actually greater than AWS's. And so kind of taking a step back, that's to say that in 3Q19, Azure added more new business dollars than AWS did. So that could be a one-quarter fluke. It could be indicative of what we should expect for the sort of coming quarters. But it is a big deal. Honestly, I mean, it just says that Microsoft Azure is able to challenge AWS for new business sort of in a head-to-head basis when you kind of abstract the revenue base that AWS has amassed thus far. So what we see AWS doing, now moving to that graph on the left-hand side, we see AWS investing more heavily in sales and marketing as a result. They don't disclose sales and marketing expenses, but they disclose their operating income. And so we've watched the operating margin kind of contract over those last 4 or 5 quarters, from this high at around 31% down to 25, 26% margins. It's not massive, but it's definitely an indicator that AWS is investing more heavily in their sales and marketing efforts as they try to compete against the heightened competition from Microsoft and sort of the rest of the non-AWS field. So there's a really interesting dynamic there, but I'm going to move on so that we can get to the other vendor profiles. So this is just sort of the kind of key points we want to make about what has been going on with SAP this year. Because 2019 has really been a big year in terms of SAP fleshing out its transition to succeeding in the sort of cloud era. And so S/4HANA is a big piece of the SAP story, clearly, and that is one that does not necessarily only favor sort of this cloud era. I think SAP is, and particularly with ERP workloads, where customers are evaluating how they balance the sort of cloud first and hybrid IT enabled discussion. The customers are looking at how they deploy their kind of mission critical and core ERP systems. But as customers make those sort of decisions and considerations, SAP in and of itself has become much more clear in the progress of S/4HANA, the intention for S/4HANA, and I think a lot of that is highlighted by more buy-in from partners and really results from the investments of professional services partners, and more clear partner roles on the part of SAP. And so SAP has really fleshed out its strategy of sort of what you'll see at the bottom, this SAP plus hyperscalers plus consulting and system integrator partners strategy, where it's really a three-legged stool that's becoming pretty clear that SAP is favoring hyperscale deployment in terms of cloud deployment. The bulk of their deployments are still really licensed solutions on-premise, but the fact that they're really supporting customers with this sort of three entity approach. The other things we've seen SAP really flesh out this year are the unification of both their products and their sort of operations. So the alignment of success factors or replatforming of success factors onto the HANA database, I think, was a key development from sort of through 2Q and 3Q. And so and Ariba's kind of going through that process, and other products starting to be replatformed as well. But not only just bringing the products together on sort of the same database to enable some of the insights, but SAP's commitment at its Capital Markets Day to really unify the operations around this unified portfolio, I think, is a big step and a good step on their part. They kind of started that whole process off by the sort of restructuring effort they announced early this year that kind of cast a lot of questions just to kick off 2019. But I really see them exiting 2019 with a much more clear vision, even though they've had so many executive shuffles with the big CEO shuffle that we saw play out in October. They're really exiting 2019 with a much more clear strategy on how they are streamlining operations to not only drive sales that will help them achieve some of their revenue targets, but also streamline operations to reach some of their margin commitments. So it's definitely a big shift from the beginning of the year to the end of the year for SAP. And with that, I will go on to the next slide and turn it over to Jack for Salesforce.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. So Salesforce, for a long time, it's been around for 20 years. It's been able to function in the front office without too much heavy competition, but that's really been changing in 2019 from the Open Data Initiative with Microsoft, SAP, and Adobe. those vendors all have front office apps, but they don't have as strong of a unified portfolio, or at least Microsoft and Adobe are not quite as strong as Salesforce. SAP's getting better. But all three together with their flagship products in that area, they're able to give a unified value proposition that really competes with Salesforce's portfolio. So it's been really facing greater competition in this past year. In terms of Salesforce trying to expand its own business, it's been really focused on industry-specific apps for a long time. Most recently, we saw that with Manufacturing Cloud and Consumer Goods Cloud. But this past year, we've also seen a lot of strong traction from Financial Services Cloud. These industry-specific versions of Services Cloud are really helping that revenue base grow and kind of approach Sales Cloud in terms of the leading revenue driver. And also the Salesforce.org acquisition, that brought in nonprofit and philanthropy cloud. And that was, prior to the acquisition, really targeted at nonprofits with a discounted pricing and was really the philanthropic arm. But because of the traction that it was gaining, Salesforce acquired that, brought it into its core portfolio, and it's still providing those discounts to qualified organizations, but it's really been selling full-price offerings that enable it to grow Salesforce.org's business. And in this past quarter, we saw it attain $80 million in revenue in 3Q. And kind of expanding beyond those CRM scenarios, Salesforce's acquisition of Tableau, that finally closed in November with the UK's Competition and Markets Authority closing their investigation. That brought Tableau's data analytics into Salesforce's portfolio. And while it does have CRM analytics similar to Einstein, they do overlap there, but neither Salesforce or Tableau CEOs are concerned about that overlap. It's more Einstein does provide that strong value proposition for CRM analytics, but Tableau could be for the broader IT environment analytics and bring in data that goes beyond Salesforce. So it really rounds out the rest of the company's analytics needs. And also Salesforce's MuleSoft acquisition, which closed more than a year ago. It's really become part of the company now. We've seen how that's started to bear fruit, and Salesforce has been very successful in growing the business since the acquisition. And alongside its proprietary solution, Customer 360, MuleSoft has been really a key part of Salesforce integrating its own portfolio using MuleSoft APIs to connect to Customer 360 and unify those customer data records, so that way there does need to be a data lake. And so it's been really strong for Salesforce, getting that unified portfolio where all of its data can really bring in new capabilities and compete with that best-of-breed apps from vendors like Microsoft and SAP. And MuleSoft has also been really great with helping customers round out their, integrate Salesforce with their back office environments. So it's been able to help Salesforce meet that enterprise need of having that unified full environment. And lastly, Salesforce has been expanding with its infrastructure as service partners really over the past 3 years. But we've seen success in 2019 with AWS in areas like Australia specifically. And this year we saw it partner with Alibaba Cloud. And with Alibaba, that brings Salesforce into the Chinese market, which is more difficult with not being able to create a proprietary data center there, not being a Chinese organization. And Tableau also partnered with Alibaba to go into China. That was before the acquisition happened, and it was kind of a happy coincidence. So while that wasn't necessarily a planned approach between the two vendors, now one, they are going to have a unified go-to-market there. So we'll see that develop in 2020. And finally, with Microsoft, there was that expansion bringing Service Cloud onto Azure, and that's going to help Salesforce kind of better tap into those customers, the Fortune 500 that are using Azure as their kind of core infrastructure as a service. While Salesforce already has a wide variety of customers in that segment, it's really going to help drive that last kind of tap into that market. And it's kind of interesting to see Salesforce and Microsoft partner at the infrastructure as a service, or using Microsoft's infrastructure as a service, because they do compete at the SaaS layer. But as Meaghan mentioned, they're more focused on PaaS, infrastructure as a service, IoT. We even saw Salesforce and Microsoft integrate Sales Cloud with Teams, I believe. So that just shows that it's Microsoft's business apps are not the core of its portfolio, so we may see some more integrations between Salesforce and Microsoft in the future. And with that, I will pass it on to Catie to cover IBM.
Great, thanks, Jack. So lastly, we want to call out IBM as a vendor of significance as we kind of reflect on 2019 when IBM completed its landmark purchase of Red Hat. So initially, some key things worth highlighting is that IBM is really relying on Red Hat for enterprise workloads. They're looking to capture the well more than half of workloads that have yet to move to the cloud. And this is a key part of their strategy in what they call the second chapter of cloud, essentially. And here they're abiding by the assumption, which is the theme of this webinar, is that customers are not fully embracing public cloud, but rather taking a hybrid and or multi-cloud approach. So it will do this with Red Hat, kind of moving past the traditional lift and shift engagement, using Red Hat's OpenShift platform, which is open source and hybrid, to really ensure kind of a secure migration to and or between multiple clouds and on-premise environments. So with that kind of being its main strategy, IBM services will play a huge role in kind of executing that. IBM services is really working toward consolidation, but the two groups have very distinct roles as it pertains to OpenShift. IBM's GTS, which is Global Technology Services, will help kind of implement OpenShift at scale, and IBM's GBS, or Global Business Services, will be responsible for migrating and building new workloads on the platform. And secondly, kind of a headwind for IBM post-merger is that it's, despite the big top-line benefit Red Hat added this past quarter, in the interim, IBM is still really trailing leading cloud providers. We do want to note they've kind of switched focus. Now they're agnostic toward infrastructure provider, and this was not the case when they started with the acquisition of SoftLayer to kind of compete in the infrastructure space. So in that regard, we do see them kind of sidestepping the competition, if you will, but now the focus is on cloud-native PaaS with OpenShift. But even in this space, competition is still pretty stiff. Just to provide some context, to close out 2019, we expect IBM to record about $2 billion in public cloud platform as a service revenue. But leaders Microsoft and AWS are sitting at about $9.1 billion and $5.7 billion respectively. And lastly is just the IBM Cloud Paks, which are one of the newer innovations that came out of this purchase. Currently there are 5. They're basically IBM's way of making its middleware portfolio cloud native. The packs are based on Red Hat components, so Red Hat's Linux and OpenShift platform, which can run in any environment. And in addition to being open, they're also secure, which is kind of a differentiator for them. IBM is leveraging Red Hat's security. Red Hat's been pretty active in kind of instilling that secure pipeline inside OpenShift. But with this approach, IBM is, to put it simply, looking to sell more software and services. The cloud packs are kind of their initial push into product bundling on all private and public clouds, and this will eventually allow them to become much more pervasive across the technology stack. And with the cloud packs, we expect that to be reflected in IBM's growth profile. IBM's Cloud and Cognitive Software segment, which is where Red Hat is reported, is expected to accelerate to double-digit growth in 2020. And from a services perspective, we'll continue to see success in kind of the advise, move, build, and manage methodology that they apply. Basically, accelerating the adoption of OpenShift will present a lot of new entry points for services.
And this is Jack. Just to kind of double-click on what Katie was saying about how IBM's sidestepping AWS and using that vendor-agnostic path. Google's been doing a similar thing with Anthos. I think that launched in April. And that similarly, it's a Kubernetes-based multi-cloud management tool set. So that kind of brought together Google's portfolio to provide an environment where customers can run a Google Cloud platform or their own on-premise infrastructure. And Google's partnered with a bunch of the hardware vendors like Dell EMC, HP, Lenovo, and working with system integration partners too to really get this ramped up and make sure that it's appealing to enterprises that are using that hardware on-prem and are looking to use like Google's machine learning and AI and those type of things. So that is something that we've seen Google kind of enter the market with, and we're going to see a stronger competition between Google's Anthos and Red Hat and IBM Cloud Private. And with that, I think we can open that up to questions.
Yeah, so we got a couple questions as we went through, so we'll start with those, but feel free to submit questions and we'll use the couple minutes. We could probably go over a little bit to see what questions we can answer that came out of the session. All right, so the first question is for the Azure revenue. How much of that was boosted by the U.S. government purchase?
I'll take that one. So I'm actually going to just go back and project the slide that I think that this was asked about. I assume this is referring to the JEDI contract, and specifically that had no impact on the 3Q19 overperformance of Azure over AWS. The JEDI contract was not announced until late October, I believe, and so with the revenue for this graph in particular closing September 30th, it actually didn't have any impact on the financial performance. I think moving forward, it's interesting because with how much airtime the JEDI contract in particular has gotten, we actually don't expect it to be the make it or break it point for financials. It's a $10 billion contract over 10 years. And so you break that down quarterly, it becomes kind of a $250 million, which is nothing to scoff at, but there are provisions for, I think, for 2 years in that the contract can actually be canceled still if Microsoft isn't performing. And also, if I understand it correctly, a fair amount of that dollar amount may actually end up in the hands of partners based on how different aspects of the contract are executed. That's not all to say that all of that is going to end up in Microsoft's Azure performance. So there's a lot of variables. I think the real value of the JEDI contract is, to summarize it a little bit too much and to look at it only from the context of sort of the Azure financials, I think the big win there is an entry point into the broader government discussions moving forward. And so JEDI is one contract, but I think that the idea that Microsoft is serving that contract as other contracts come up for proposal and ultimately for decision, that I think that Azure's performance under that contract is really going to be key as the government's sort of evaluating future projects.
Okay, great. Another question kind of focused on AWS and Azure. how do the hybrid offerings from AWS and Azure compare against each other?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, I think you can tackle that from a lot of different angles. We have a lot of coverage on different hybrid aspects. I think one of the most clear pieces is sort of the hybrid IT kind of idea, this Azure Stack versus AWS Outpost offerings. The Azure Stack portfolio is more mature than the Outpost portfolio. I mean, Azure Stack was launched years ahead of the AWS Outpost, and Azure Stack has a lot more variations than sort of the Outpost, different architectures and things like of that nature. Overall, I think that kind of would be the answer, that Azure is much more mature currently, and there's a lot of nuances to that with regard to sort of the legacy portfolio and of Microsoft and sort of the existence of long-standing Microsoft shops across sort of, when you think about legacy IT, there's a lot of IBM shops, there's a lot of Microsoft shops, and there's a lot of Oracle database customers. And so where Microsoft has those sort of enterprise inroads in that sense, and customers who are bought into the Microsoft ecosystem, they have not only the capabilities but the mind share and footprint to support those hybrid IT environments pretty comprehensively.
And last question is kind of a tag on to this one. Thoughts around the Google Cloud Anthos offering?
Sorry, was that one more time?
What are your thoughts around Google Cloud and their Anthos offering? So I think Jack just kind of covered this a little bit, but you want to summarize your points?
Yeah. So I think that Google kind of was originally trying to compete with AWS and Microsoft in terms of just being an infrastructure as a service provider, but switching to Anthos really is helping them compete because they're able to kind of just address that PaaS layer where customers or enterprises aren't really trying to lift and shift everything into like a Microsoft environment or AWS where it's going to be on AWS Outpost infrastructure, for example. So I think from that perspective, they have a good value proposition against those. And also, Google is a leader in Kubernetes. They're the ones who created it. So I think that them providing a hybrid path that's Kubernetes-based, I think there's some really strong value in that, and they've really done well building their entire portfolio around Kubernetes. So I think they're a strong bet for that type of environment.
Okay, great. We'll leave the line open for a little bit. If you want to submit more questions, we'll try to get back to everybody, at least via email. I'll hand it back to Sarah.
All right, everyone, please feel free to reach out to the team with any follow-up questions. If you have a few moments, it would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out the survey on your screen. A replay version of the webcast will be available after the event and will be sent out to you via email. To view a list of our upcoming and past webinars, please visit tbri.com. Be sure to join us next Wednesday, December 18th, for Will New Management Consulting Models Support Digital Transformation? Thank you and have a great day.